relocation organizations are not following the laws that have already been passed by Congress. Now, it's important to emphasize that the threats to America's security are difficult to assess. If you recall, the day before the Paris attack, the President of the United States came out and said that ISIS was contained. The week before the San Bernardino attack, the President said there was no credible intelligence indicating a plot on the homeland. So ISIS's capabilities have eluded even the President of the United States. That is why Texas and other states are doing even more to ensure that we safeguard the security of the citizens of our states. Equally important, the threat to America's security is very real. The FBI director told Congress that the federal government simply cannot conduct effective security checks on Syrian nationals. The director of national intelligence spoke directly about the threats that are posed by refugees. He said that, "I don't put it past the likes of ISIL to infiltrate operatives among the refugees." And then just this week, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Michael McCaul, said individuals tied to terrorist groups in Syria have already tried to access our country through the refugee program. And then, compounding these dangers, the President himself has granted waivers allowing into the United States refugees who provided material support to terrorists. Well, America is a charitable nation, but we cannot allow charity for some to compromise the safety for all. That is what has happened by the way that the federal government has interpreted and applied the Refugee Act that already exists. The current Refugee Act has been interpreted and applied in ways that compromise the safety and security of people in Texas as well as other states across the country. And it's contrary to the way the law was written. The law specifically states that Congress intended to give states a substantial role in the refugee relocation process. The federal government and the resettlement agencies have ignored and sidestepped that role. Senator Cruz's legislation strengthens the role of states and governors to ensure the safety and security of our citizens. My top priority as the governor of Texas is to keep the citizens of Texas safe. With Senator Cruz's new proposed act, I'm better equipped to accomplish that goal. So thank you, Senator Cruz.
Thank you very much, Governor, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership. Governor Abbott and I have worked together for many, many years. For 5.5 years, you were my boss when you were the Attorney General of Texas, and you served our state tremendously well as Attorney General, and you are doing an even better job as Governor, providing strong leadership for the state of Texas at a time when the challenges continue to get greater and greater. We are today at a time of war. We've seen the attacks in Paris. We've seen the attack in San Bernardino. ISIS and radical Islamic terrorists have declared war on America, even if President Obama refuses to admit it. And they are waging war on America. ISIS represents the face of evil. They are crucifying Christians. They are beheading journalists. And they have stated their intention to murder as many Americans as possible. Unfortunately, in a time of war, we have a commander-in-chief who refuses to acknowledge the enemy, much less confront the enemy, much less do what it takes to defeat the enemy. President Obama recently went overseas and said he doesn't believe in American leadership or America winning, that he doesn't have time for that. I think the American people want to see leadership in this country, and they want to see America winning again. Following the attack in San Bernardino, the President did a nationally televised address, the entire course of which he never said the words radical Islamic terrorism. And unfortunately, this politically correct blindness is impacting the policy decisions of this administration. One consequence is that we have no strategy, as President Obama has told us several times, to defeat ISIS. ISIS is getting stronger because the President refuses to lead and do what it takes to utterly destroy them. But another consequence of the politically correct blindness is President Obama's proposal to bring tens of thousands of Syrian refugees to this country, even though his own head of the FBI has told Congress that the Obama administration cannot vet these refugees to determine whether or not they are ISIS terrorists, whether or not they are jihadists. That should be the end of the matter. The first obligation of the President is to be Commander-in-Chief to keep this country safe. But unfortunately, this President is not willing to carry out that role. A partisan political agenda dominates. And even though the FBI tells us, as Director Comey put it, they don't have the information on which Syrians are affiliated with ISIS, which Syrians are jihadists, and so they can query the database until the cows come home, and it will produce no results. Even though the FBI told the President that, his political agenda moves him to go forward. Since the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis, more than 2,300 refugees from Syria have already been admitted to the United States, many of them to Texas. And the President intends to bring in 10,000 more this fiscal year. That's roughly a third of the 34,000 total refugees the President proposes to accept from the Near East and South Asia regions. The President has also informed Congress that he intends to accept as many as 25,000 refugees from Africa as well. This week, at least 21 Syrian refugees are scheduled to arrive in Texas. And perhaps hundreds more are anticipated to arrive during the next year. This makes no sense. We should not be bringing in refugees when our own FBI tells us we cannot ascertain whether or not they are ISIS terrorists. We know that at least one of the terrorists who attacked Paris came in with the refugee program. We know that ISIS has stated it intends to carry out similar terror attacks here in America. And we know also that one of the two terrorists who committed the worst act of Islamic terrorism on U.S. soil since the Fort Hood terrorist attack in our home state of Texas. We know that at least one of those terrorists came in on a fiancé visa, the female terrorist. And the vetting for the fiancé visa was the very same vetting that President Obama tells us will keep us safe from ISIS terrorists coming from Syria. We know that this female terrorist filled out a fictional home address on her fiancé visa, and yet the Obama administration's vetting did not discover that. And even though these individuals had had numerous contacts with people on the terror watch list, even though the female terrorist had communicated with ISIS terrorists on social media and had pledged her allegiance to the Islamic State, the Obama administration failed to anticipate it, failed to stop this attack, failed to do what was necessary to keep us safe. If the Commander-in-Chief won't act, then it's incumbent on Congress to act. There are a great many American people that are eager for the final year of the Obama presidency to come to an end. But in the meantime, Congress has an obligation to act to keep America safe. There are 3 pieces of legislation I've introduced that I urge leaders in Congress to take up and pass immediately to address this terror threat. The first piece of legislation Governor Abbott just described is legislation that would impose a 3-year moratorium on the refugees coming from countries where ISIS or Al-Qaeda control a substantial amount of territory. This is legislation that is targeted directly to the problem. And the reason is simple. We have been told by the FBI they cannot vet these refugees. And our first obligation should be protecting our national security. The second piece of legislation Governor Abbott mentioned is legislation that I filed today that will protect the authority of the states and the authority of governors to keep their citizens safe. And it would say that in the event the president wants to send refugees to a particular state, that a governor has the ability to opt out, to conclude that the federal government has not done a sufficient job ensuring that the safety and security of the citizens of a state will be protected, and so to decline to settle those refugees in that state. Some 30 governors across the country have stood together following the lead of Governor Abbott, standing together as one, saying their obligation is to protect the safety and security of the citizens of Texas and the citizens of each of the states that have elected those governors. Those officials are doing their jobs. They're honoring their commitments to the men and women who elected them. We need a president who will do the same. It is my hope that Congress will take up and pass into law the legislation that I introduced today that gives governors the ability to opt out if the federal government is not sufficiently vetting refugees to ensure that they are not a terror threat. And then the third piece of legislation that I have tried to bring up in recent weeks and that Democrats have blocked is the Expatriate Terrorist Act, which provides that if an American goes and travels abroad and joins ISIS and takes up arms and wages jihad against the United States, that he or she forfeits their U.S. citizenship. We should not be allowing ISIS terrorists to come into America with a U.S. passport and wage jihad against innocent citizens. All of these are reasonable, common sense steps to keep America safe. And if President Obama is not going to lead, then it is incumbent on Republicans and Democrats in Congress to stand up and say, we know our top obligation is keeping the men and women of this country safe. We know that our top obligation is doing everything possible to prevent another Paris attack, to prevent another San Bernardino attack, to prevent the next attack. Because as long as the federal government is not doing its job, we know there will be another and another and another. We face an enemy who has stated their intention to bring death to America. And we need that same strength of resolve and leadership in the United States to keep our citizens safe. And with that, we will take any questions.
First, it's important to understand that Texas continues to maintain its lawsuit trying to block Syrian refugees from being relocated to the state of Texas. As to why the decision was made to drop the request for emergency relief, that decision was made by the Attorney General's office, and I would have to refer you to them for information as to why they chose that pathway. But let me finish. And that is, in my capacity as governor, I will continue to do everything that I can to ensure that refugees from Syria who could pose a danger to the people of the state of Texas will not be allowed to relocate into the state of Texas.
When Castro came to power in 1959,
I disagree with that proposal. I like Donald Trump. A lot of our friends here have encouraged me to criticize and attack Donald Trump. I'm not interested in doing so, but I believe we need a plan that is focused on the direct threat, and the threat we're facing is radical Islamic terrorism. It's why I've introduced legislation focused on suspending for 3 years, putting in place a moratorium on refugees from countries where ISIS or al-Qaeda control substantial territory, because that is the threat we're facing.
Senator Cruz, two questions. One, the three mistakes you've outlined. What is your attitude about how Congress should deal with the refugee issue within the context of the omnibus and the looming shutdown on Friday? And what legislative maneuvers will you undertake to press your case forward? Secondly, you just told us you disagree with Donald Trump. The three pieces of legislation you've outlined work through a legislative process in concert with the Constitution. Do you believe what Donald Trump talked about yesterday is in any way, shape, or form, and Governor, I'd like your thoughts on this as well, with the constitutional approach this country has long taken to issues of security?
Well, let me start with the first question. I think we should use every legislative tool we have to keep this country safe. So, of course, we should use the omnibus. We should use every tool we have to protect the safety and security of American citizens, and that ought to be the top priority of Congress.
If it's not in, will you do something to try to slow that down?
I will continue to press using the procedural tools that are available to a senator, but it is my hope that we'll see real leadership. This ought to be something that brings people together. You know, it is remarkable seeing Texas, for example, leading the state, seeing 30 governors stand together. Stand as one and say this doesn't make sense to endanger the safety and security of American citizens. I'd like to see that same strength of resolve demonstrated in Congress. And it is my hope that we'll see leaders, both Republican leaders and Democratic leaders, ought to be equally concerned about the safety and security of the citizens they represent. This should be something that brings us together, and I hope that it will be.
Donald Trump and the constitutional aspects of what he proposed, because it's very important you have an experienced background in this, and I'd like your thoughts on yours as well.
Well, I am focused on my policies and the solutions that I am proposing to the real problems in this country. And I recognize that a great many folks in the media would prefer that anyone running for president engage in as an ongoing theater critic, criticizing the proposals of others. I do not agree with his proposal. I do not think it is the right solution. And the right solution, I believe, is the legislation that I've introduced, but the broader solution is actually far bigger than that. The broader solution is a commander-in-chief willing to speak the truth, willing to name the enemy, radical Islamic terrorism, and willing to do whatever it takes to utterly destroy and defeat radical Islamic terrorism and to defeat ISIS. And if I'm elected president, that's exactly what I'll do.
Let me answer this, and that is the Constitution specifically speaks to this very issue. The Constitution mandates that the federal government of the United States must protect our citizens from enemies, both foreign and domestic. The fact is we have an enemy here, and that is radical Islamic terrorists. And that's precisely what Senator Cruz is trying to address by stepping up and playing a leadership role and trying to do what the president is failing this country in trying to achieve, and that is protecting us from radical Islamic terrorists.
But is what Donald Trump talked about consistent with that, in your belief?
I couldn't hear you. So,
Is what Donald Trump is proposing consistent with that from your constitutional perspective?
I think that the correct approach is precisely the approach that Senator Cruz has articulated, because the approach Senator Cruz articulated is the one that is consistent with the United States Constitution.
Well, listen, certainly in the media there has been no shortage of criticism for Donald Trump. And I do not believe the world needs my voice added to that chorus of critics. And listen, I commend Donald Trump for standing up and focusing America's attention on the need to secure our borders. Border security is national security. I would note that no one can purport to be protecting the national security of this country if they are not prepared to secure the borders and prevent both the law enforcement and national security threats that are coming across the southern border. I think Donald Trump has done a good job focusing the American people's attention on the need to do so, and I think also we need to focus on the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. Listen, when you have President Obama telling the nation that the Islamic State isn't Islamic, that's just nutty. That's not reasoned, interesting foreign policy debate. That is nutty. They are explicitly an Islamic caliphate. They have stated their intention to wage jihad and to forcibly convert or murder anyone they define as infidels, which is most of the rest of the world. And in particular, they direct their hatred at what they call the little Satan, which is Israel, and even more directly what they call the great Satan, which is America. And we need to understand that they have declared war on us, and we need to act to protect ourselves and to win the war. Rather than President Obama's stated intention to have no American leadership and not have America winning, we need to get back to how Ronald Reagan described our strategy should be in the Cold War. Our strategy with radical Islamic terrorism should be very simple. We win, they lose.
Hey, we got to cut it out there. I've got one more question. Right here.
Canada's going to be taking tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. Do you think we should do anything to seal our northern border?
I think we should act to protect our national security. It is a decision for Canada to make, and that as any sovereign nation, they can make a decision. But I hope that all of our allies act to keep their citizens safe and to keep our citizens safe. And, you know, I would note that there's some in the media who suggest that a desire to keep this country safe is somehow not compassionate. Indeed, President Obama has taken to, twice in recent weeks, he has attacked me directly, calling me un-American and offensive. Now, set aside the irony that he was standing on Turkish soil when President Obama called me un-American. I would note that he makes these insults from the cheap seats where no one can respond. And indeed, in response to that, I invited President Obama to debate his Syrian refugee policy at any time and any place he chooses. I'd prefer it to be on American soil. If he's so convinced the policy is right, then he ought to be willing to defend it. But instead, what President Obama and many of his acolytes in the media do is condescend and insult the American people, that somehow we are not compassionate for the humanitarian crisis that is playing out in the Middle East. There is no doubt it is a humanitarian crisis. I would note that this crisis is a direct result of the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, of America leading from behind, receding from the world, and allowing radical Islamic terrorism to rise up, allowing ISIS, which the president wrongly dismissed as the junior varsity, to declare a caliphate and to wage war against us. And the long-term solution to this humanitarian crisis is to utterly defeat ISIS. That's the long-term solution. But I would also note that America has provided $1.2 billion to help take care of these Syrian refugees. We are an amazingly generous and compassionate people. $1.2 billion, that is over 10 times as much as the next closest country. So I will tell you, anytime I hear President Obama lecturing or insulting the American people as not being humanitarian or compassionate, I think that is offensive. When the people of America are providing 10 times as much as any other nation on earth to care for these refugees, but at the same time, we want a leader who will keep American citizens safe. That is the first obligation of a commander-in-chief. Governor Abbott is showing strong leadership to keep the men and women of Texas safe. We need a president that shows the same focused leadership on protecting the men and women of this country. And in the absence of that president, we need leaders in Congress who will honor our constitutional obligation to protect this nation. Thank you very much.
Would you still support Donald Trump if you're nominated? Would you pledge to do that, Senator? Would you still pledge to support Donald Trump if you're nominated?
I will absolutely support the Republican nominee, but I hope and intend for that nominee to be me.